Salutations, fellow nerds. I'm Rick Y, the wise guy. In today's December 16th, 2024, a recent turn of events down south may be impacting our country more than we think it does now as Cuba is in dire straits. And given our proximity to it and a thriving Cuban-American culture, especially down in Florida, I felt like it would be more prudent of me to catch everyone up on some details that may need to be on everyone's radar in the coming years. So if you like news updates, history, and general Americana, to include some upcoming cooking material once I have the appropriate tools set up, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you want updates in real time, diddle that little notification bell. I'd be much obliged. For those of you who are unaware and do not live in Florida, and specifically Miami-Dade County, you'd be forgiven if you were not really updated on how much the Cuban culture has significantly contributed to Florida society and how it's allowed so many different parts of it to grow. And in that county alone, estimates vary, but anywhere between 911,000 and 1.2 million residents of Cuban origin live there as of 2023. And what's interesting is almost 70% of them voted for Donald Trump. How could this be? You see, back in the 1960s, the U.S. government created laws specifically for Cuban immigrants. These laws are actually fairly beneficial to them, and Cuban Americans to this day enjoy a few more freedoms and liberties when it comes to their immigration process due to our approach to Cuban immigration than those who are being demonized at our Texas and California borders. Although nowhere near as lenient as they once were, these laws have incentivized an increase of migration to our country. In fact, some local television news stations have also called a recent influx of Cubans to our shores a migrant crisis. And while it isn't getting a lot of coverage, it's probably important to have our attentions fixed there as well, since recent events have really rocked the island nation. And record numbers of Cubans have been detained, making their way over the Florida Straits. And there's a number of reasons for this, and all of them are culminating into economic and, dare I say, national collapse. From the pandemic to sanctions that have all but squeezed the tiny nation of resources and money, food and medicine shortages are going through the roof. Not to mention the entire nation relies upon a power grid that is reliant completely upon oil. No other energy infrastructure exists to prop the system up that was built in the 1960s due to the Soviet Union sending fuel to them for free. During the period, it made perfect sense to make the grid dependent upon a free resource, but by failing to diversify through a number of reasons, and when that import was no longer something that they could take advantage of, it began to weigh heavily on both their society and their supplies. It became worse as oil became the most expensive way to produce electricity, which made this untenable without updates. Granted, they're currently working with China and other nations to try and increase their solar capacity. Now, furthermore, they haven't actually been able to keep these systems well maintained over the years, and some are breaking down. This is causing widespread blackouts. Remember, this is also a nation that sits fairly close to the equator, and as such, it receives year-long heat and humidity. Having no access to electricity makes an intolerable condition actually life-threatening to residents. Hospitals were incapable of treating critical patients without the proper equipment, and ACs failed. And then came hurricane season, and specifically Rafael. Strengthening to a Category 3 storm, Hurricane Rafael made landfall in the West Cuba on November 6th from the south and devastated an already struggling nation. This year alone, they've been hit with 4 hurricanes above Category 3. Rafael in particular has affected over 10 million people on its own and further crippled Cuba's already failing electric infrastructure. A noteworthy piece to all of this is our own national politics. Many Americans were actually left confused as to how and why Cubans ran to Republicans, Donald Trump in particular. The whole party is running on an anti-immigrant policy, and he actually made plans to create detention facilities or camps where immigrants will be concentrated to be deported en masse. It seems like this is kind of counterintuitive at the very least, to support anyone with that as their goal or agenda if you're an immigrant. Well, there are actually some fairly legitimate reasons here. One of them being that a lot of Cubans who are here for security don't feel as though they're part of the bad immigrants that they've been convinced that Trump is specifying. Another reason for it is due to the fear of communism. Immigrants from Central and South America, and specifically Cubans, have left their homes to end up on our shores because they were escaping lives and regimes that they felt were threatening. Republicans have actually taken advantage of this generalized fear and adhered it to Democrats by labeling them with terms like socialism. And the problem therein lay with the gross misrepresentation of the term socialism purely to incite fear. Again, if a person is trying to get you to be afraid and not thoughtful, your best interests aren't their motivations. Democrats and liberals have adopted more socialist principles, but all still wish to have them remain within this capitalist bubble, the way other services like first responders, the highway system, and the Department of Education is. So everyone benefits from the taxes that we all spend, and not as much of a way to turn over complete power and control of a society to an autocratic dictator. Having already experienced the horrid consequences of doing so, Cuban Americans are not quick to just open their hearts and minds to people with whom they've been convinced want to welcome in the latter. Some of his incoming officials, Donald Trump, are actually eyeing the Dade County as a solid place for a primary deportation strategy, so unfortunately these assumptions appear to have been incorrect. But there are also other reasons that don't get spoken about as regularly as they probably should. The Biden administration has actually clamped down on certain trademarks, and in so doing, has actually done quite a bit of harm to the lives of Cubans directly. One of the most famous rum producers is called Bacardi, and has been around since, if you can believe it, the height of the Civil War. And due to its massive success here and globally, it was a massive contributor to the economy in Cuba with very few other export options. But then, during the famous revolution where Fidel Castro rose to power, the government took immediate control of all assets within Cuba's borders. Because of this, the makers of the rum stopped producing the rum inside of Cuban territory and exclusively turned to their facilities in Mexico and Puerto Rico. A specific type of that rum was produced by Bacardi was called Havana Club. Due to financial issues, the parent company was able to purchase the trademark for Havana Club. In 2024, Biden further reinforced the trademark laws regarding Havana Club rum specifically and essentially removed it from Cuba's market for good, and making it an exclusive American corporation. Along with that, many Cubans have seen immigration legislation by the Biden administration as being nothing more than a stopgap measure that don't really tackle the very real diplomatic issues that the country is experiencing. These fraught times for Cuban Americans and their families in Cuba are not being discussed as much as they need to be. And because of this, much of the conversation regarding immigration reform is being overlooked. There are very real human problems that occur at borders that you can either put a fence on or patrol by boat. And with economic changes, global climate change, and a changing infrastructure as far as energy is concerned, Cuba and her people are feeling as though they were exploited by nuclear powers and left on the back burner ever since, to be forgotten by a world that was all too ready to turn its back on them. I'm going to try and keep bringing updates on the goings-on because the wedge issue focuses on Texas and the other western states, when there's actually a very real emergency when it comes to the more broad discussion of our immigration policies in our most southern state as well. Without an empathetic consensus, we risk damaging a relationship with a neighbor with whom we could very well turn the ugly page of the past on and start working together with for a more brighter, unified Caribbean. The only way we can all make sure we do that is to stay informed, stay engaged and stay decent. Until next time. Peace.